So last week I took a little side trip from talking about the apostles, and I want to spend a little bit of time on the apostles, probably this week and next, and talk about these guys. So this is, of course, the earliest known image that we have of Peter and Paul, where they're both depicted together, and I pointed this out a couple of weeks ago, that these images, and these are from the second half of the 4th century, so these are, hundreds of years after the deaths of these two, but still pretty early in our history of heritage. These are more than a millennia and a half old, but they're consistent with the early imagery in the sense that Peter is always shown with a full head of hair and a relatively short beard, and often with reddish tints in his hair, and Paul is always shown bald, or with the forehead gigantically high, and with a longer beard. And Paul is almost always depicted as shorter, whether somewhat shorter or significantly shorter. Paul is depicted as shorter. And these two are from very early on given primacy of place in the iconography that we see. That is, when apostles are depicted together, Peter and Paul are always given the most significant place. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. So let's talk a little bit about Peter a little bit more deeply. So this is an icon from the St. Catherine Monastery in Egypt in the Sinai. And it's typical of the kind of depictions that we see from Peter early on, in the sense that although he's all gray hair and no red hair, so this is an older version of him, he's still full head of hair, shorter beard, and he's depicted with keys because of Jesus' statement about giving him the keys to the kingdom. One of the things that we see very early on in images of the apostles is that the artists almost always try to depict them with something, some tangible thing, something in their hands or something that they're posed with, which represents something about who they are specifically. And so Peter routinely is depicted with keys. Some of the others are depicted primarily with something that represents the tradition about the way that they died. But some of them are depicted routinely with something that is related to what is believed to be true about them as people. But a few things that are important to keep in mind about Peter is that the lists of the 12 in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Acts, Peter is always listed first. Secondly, his name is Simon, son of John. But he is called Peter or Petra or Cephas. Petra means the rock, except that at the time, it might have meant more like the pebble, the really little rock, the sort of rock that you get in your shoe, and it irritates you, and you got to take your shoe off to remove it. So this is a play on his name. But the question, of course, is what does this really mean? I will call you Petra, I will call you the rock, and upon this rock I will build my church. So down through the ages, a lot of Christians have thought this means that this word rock means something mighty and stable and powerful, and that Peter was mighty and powerful, and this was going to be a great foundation to build on. Now, if the word rock, if Petra really means more like a pebble, what does that mean? How do you interpret that passage in light of that possibility? Upon this pebble I will build my church. Here's the interesting thing when you think about the way that Jesus names some of his disciples. Think about Nathanael. The one big interaction he has with Nathanael is when Nathanael first comes to him and Jesus greets him by saying, "An Israelite indeed, in whom there is no guile." Now, what is it that Nathanael has just said that Jesus is kind of commenting on and responding to? Could anything good come out of Nazareth? And Nazareth is sort of a truck stop, if you will, of the day. Nazareth is an intersection of caravan routes. And so the caravans pass through going in different directions, and you get the caravan drivers coming in, who are sort of the long distance truckers of the day and have basically that same kind of manners and background. Okay, Nazareth was a tough town. Okay, Nazareth wasn't a beautiful, lovely place. It was a kind of rugged place to live and to grow up, with lots of outsiders passing through who were not there to bring potpourris and doilies. They were there because they were doing hard work carrying stuff from place to place. And so thinking of Nazareth as sort of a truck stop is a useful image today for us as a way to think about the city, the town, the environment there. And so Nathanael says, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" And Jesus responds, "An Israelite indeed, in whom there is no guile." Now, the question about Jesus' comment is Jesus' comment really affirming of Nathanael? Or is Jesus' comment a reminder to Nathanael that, dude, you're really unfiltered? And that might be an issue. What about James and John, the sons of thunder, Boanerges? The word that comes from is really difficult to get at from the linguistic perspective. So it's hard to know for certain what that word really means. So sons of thunder is a popular translation of it, but it's also possible to translate that word the Thunder Boys. And if you translate that as James and John are the Thunder Boys, does that give you a different perspective on them? Does that ring differently than the sons of thunder? Because if they're the Thunder Boys, it's possible that Jesus' point to them was, you guys are all bark and no bite. You guys say a lot of stuff, you yap a lot, but you don't do very much. Now, if Jesus' point in his comment to Nathanael is, you're a little too unfiltered, and if his point to James and John is, you guys are all bark and no bite, and he calls Peter the little rock, one of the things that's possible here is that Jesus' comments to these guys are actually intended to push them to grow. Or maybe to push them to develop. There was a pitcher for the Dodgers that was in their minor league system who was really pretty good. Great arm, great potential, but he was really underperforming. And Tommy Lasorda was the manager of the Dodgers at the time, and he was looking at this guy in spring training, and he thought, this guy is just too meek, he's too inside of his own head, he is not working hard enough, he should be trying to dominate. So Tommy Lasorda nicknamed him Bulldog, which all the other guys in the clubhouse thought was total mockery because the guy was the anti-Bulldog. But Lasorda kept referring to him as Bulldog and insisted that people call him Bulldog. And Orel Hershiser went on to log 2,000 strikeouts, be the most valuable player in the World Series, and win the Cy Young Award as the best pitcher in the National League. He became the Bulldog. Lasorda called him that so much that he eventually began to embody that. And there's a possibility that the things that Jesus says to his disciples are not actually true in a full sense at the time he starts talking to them about that, but they're intended to become true. Is Peter really a rock when he gets started? The basis, the guy that you would build something around? I mean, he's the assertive, impulsive, speaks first and thinks later. He's seen as a leader. He's a guy, one of the three at the Transfiguration, one of the three that Jesus brings apart at Gethsemane when he's praying. But Peter is courageous and cowardly. He's strong and unreliable. Just on the night of Gethsemane, Peter is called apart as one of the three that Jesus chooses to come with him to prayer. He falls asleep repeatedly. He attacks the high priest's servant with the sword. He flees. He changes his mind and follows at a distance. He denies Jesus 3 times. He weeps over his failure. That happens in 8 hours. Maybe less. How much zigging and zagging is that? That's characteristic of Peter before the resurrection. He's never consistently the rock in any sense in that time. You know, he is more like the pebble. But he grows into something. And it's really possible that what Jesus is saying here with all these guys is he is challenging them to grow up and to grow into something much more significant. And so, you know, the Roman Catholic Church clings to the idea that Jesus is honoring something great about Peter, that he sees greatness. But the language doesn't necessarily support that. And there's as much possibility that Jesus is trying to push Peter by calling him that, or remind him of his own deficiencies as he is anything else, to push him towards growth. It's interesting, in the Gospels, in a ministry context, Peter is almost always referred to as Peter or Cephas in the Gospels. Anytime he's being rebuked, he is referred to as Simon, as if this is part of his old life, his old nature. You're falling back into these old things. When Jesus rebukes him, he always addresses him as Simon, not as Peter, not as Cephas. So, and in the Gospels, it's always Simon's house, Simon's mother-in-law, Simon's work as a fisherman. So in the Gospels, we see the use of the name Simon applied to kind of the old life, and the name Peter applied to what he's supposed to be growing into on a pretty consistent basis. In John's Gospel, John departs from that. John's the only one who doesn't do that. John almost always calls him Simon Peter. John kind of wants to have it both ways. Or John thinks of him in this duality of two natures. And in 2 Peter, in Peter's second letter, he calls himself Simon Peter. and this should be a reminder to all of us that, the old nature and the new, we are supposed to be driving towards the new, living the new, but the old nature clings so closely, and some of the times we're doing that. So Peter actually has the two names that fit that duality of growth in the faith and falling back into sin, that duality of success as a Christian and failure as a Christian. So a few other things that we know about Peter. Peter was married. Jesus healed his mother-in-law, right? And Paul says that Peter traveled and ministered with his wife. 1 Corinthians 9:5. Paul points out, am I not an apostle? Paul is justifying his own apostleship, and Paul is pointing out, I never asked you for any support. I came, I worked on the side, I supported myself by making tents, I provided my own income. I do all these things in order to not be a burden to you. And yet other apostles, guys like Peter, travel around with their wife with them. The implication is that Peter is not working some kind of a side job. He's not supporting himself. And indeed, that he travels with his wife and people welcome him in, and them as a family. In Capernaum, a church was built in AD 352 on the traditional side of his house. The church that was built, and the ruins of this church are still there underneath the church that was built later on. But the current church sits on top of a church that was built in 352, which sits on top of an ancient neighborhood. The church that was built in 352, they cut the buildings that were on that site down to low walls. So they removed the roofs and the upper parts of the walls and then filled in so that would be preserved, that the footprint of the old thing would be preserved. And when they built the foundation for the 4th century church, they actually built bridges in the foundation over certain parts of the ancient thing that was below, so that they didn't have to destroy it and they didn't incorporate it into the foundation. Instead, they didn't touch it. They built the new church so it was above this, but not in contact with it. There is the central room of the house that is in the center of the ancient church, has markings and other things that suggest it was a place of some veneration very, very early on, that people visited it and thought it was a very important place. The church in 352 is really different than churches of the earliest era. That in the 4th century you start to see the building of churches, and the church at Capernaum was different. It's an 8-sided basilica. There is no other ancient church that is an 8-sided building. So it seems like maybe it wasn't actually built as a church at all, that it was built as a memorial of some sort. It was built as a place to come see something, interact with something, engage with something. But it was not built on the standard layout of a church at the time. It's really different. But because there was an effort to preserve the ancient ruins underneath, and there's some evidence that those were venerated from the 1st century, it seems like maybe the church that was built there was less for worship than it was for pilgrims to come and visit and see something. Peter's house in Capernaum was, Mark says, was the key base for Jesus' ministry in Galilee. Mark repeatedly has Jesus returning to this house. the first 10 chapters of Mark. There are repeated instances of Jesus at this particular house in engaging in ministry there. I talked about Egeria. Egeria was a woman in the 4th century who traveled from Spain or maybe Gaul as a single woman of some wealth and traveled through the ancient Near East to visit all the great sites of Christianity in her mind. And so we talked a little bit last week about her visit to Edessa and what she says she saw there. But she says she went to Capernaum and saw the relatively new church and was shown other things that had to do with Peter's house when she went there. So that was part of her touristy itinerary that happened within about 15 years of the time that the church was built there. So the church was pretty brand new when Egeria went there. So ministry-wise, Peter, of course, in Acts is associated with the church in coastal Judea, Joppa, and the church in Samaria. When Philip goes to Samaria and shares the gospel, Peter goes up there as part. Peter and John go up there to investigate and are shocked and amazed when the Holy Spirit comes upon the Samaritans just as it did at the Pentecost, which Peter then reports back to the rest of the apostles that this is a sign that we cannot contravene, that God is taking his word to the Samaritans. And then Peter is invited to go to the centurion's house, and when he goes to the centurion's house, the same thing happens there. And so Peter has these 3 experiences where the Spirit moves in visible ways at the preaching of the gospel with 3 different kinds of people. At the Pentecost, the sermon is almost all to Jews who have come to Jerusalem for the Passover. In Samaria, it's to Samaritans, half-breeds, people who are not allowed in the temple, people who typically worship on the mountainsides of Samaria. And at the centurion's house, not only are they Gentiles, they're Roman occupiers, educated in the Greek tradition. So Peter is the guy who is in each of these things, and so he has an early association with the church throughout Judea and in Samaria. He has some association with the church in Antioch because Paul says in Galatians, which is the first of the epistles that Paul wrote, that Peter came to Antioch, and when he got to Antioch, he was hanging out with the Greek-speaking, Hellenized Christians there until some Jewish guys came from Jerusalem, at which point he suddenly decided that he would associate only with the Hebrew-speaking Jewish Christians, actively Jewish Christians there. And Paul says, I opposed him to his face. I reproved him. So Peter was in Antioch at least long enough for this to occur, several weeks anyway. So Peter has some history with the church at Antioch, as does Paul, perhaps less than Paul does. Paul was there for several years. Peter has some association with the church at Corinth from fairly early on. The thing at Antioch has to have happened pretty early because Paul writes to the Galatians probably shortly after returning from his first missionary journey, or maybe on his second missionary journey. He's writing to the Galatians, and this thing with Peter has already happened. So this is fairly early on in the story. It's in the 30s sometime, the late 30s probably. Peter has some association with the church at Corinth. In 1 Corinthians, Paul is very concerned about divisions in the church, disunity in the church, about how the people in the church at Corinth have made themselves loyal to individuals rather than to the work of the gospel. People associate themselves with a person. And so they have the people who are the followers of Paul, and the people who are the followers of Peter, and the people that are the followers of Apollos. And then the people who say, well, no, we're the followers of Christ. So we have 4 different groups, at least in the church, who have associated themselves with these different people. Now, you're not going to have people that are associated with Peter unless Peter's been there. We know that Apollos had been there and preached. We know that Paul had been there and preached. So Peter had apparently been there enough that there were people who associated themselves with him. And so he has some history at the church at Corinth. We don't know what the deal is with that. And of course, he has some association with the church at Rome. Now, the Roman Catholic Church keeps an official list of popes. And the first guy on their official list of popes is Peter. And their official list of popes has the dates for each papacy, for each person's time as pope. And Peter's term on the official Roman Catholic list starts in either 30 or 33 AD. That is, it happens from the time of Jesus' ascension and goes until his death in either 64 or 67 AD. So the official Roman Catholic position is that Jesus ascends, Peter preaches at the Pentecost, and after that, he is the Bishop of Rome. Now, that's not true. Peter went through Judea. Peter did ministry in Samaria. Peter went to Antioch. Peter went to Corinth. And Peter almost certainly also went to Pontus and Bithynia on the coast of the Black Sea. This is a place, of course, where Paul said, the Spirit blocked me from going there, which might have been because Peter was there or was going there. But Peter went there. We know that because 1 Peter is addressed to who? People in Pontus and Bithynia and Cappadocia. He addresses 1 Peter to people in 4 places, and it's pretty clear that he knows these people, so he's been there. So we know that Peter's ministered in these places. The other thing about an early date for Peter in Rome is when Paul writes to the Romans, he writes this letter to the Romans. And this is not one of his early epistles. And the epistle to the Romans, one of the reasons it stands out, one of the more minor reasons, is chapter 16. In chapter 16, he has a long list of people. Paul has not been to Rome yet, but there's a long list of people at Rome that he knows. Greet Prisca and Aquila. Greet the church in their house. Greet Epaenetus. Greet Mary. Greet Andronicus and Junia. Greet Ampliatus. Greet Urbanus and my beloved Stachys. Greet Apelles. Greet those who belong to the family of Aristobulus. Greet my kinsman Herodian. Greet the family of Narcissus. Greet Tryphena and Tryphosa. Greet the beloved Persis. Greet Rufus. Greet Asyncritus, Phlegon, Hermes, Patrobas, Hermas, and the brothers who are with them. Greet Philologus, Julia, Nereus and his sister, and Olympus, and all the saints who are with them. It's a lot of people. Who's not on that list? Paul knew Peter. If he's going to greet that many people in Rome, and Peter was there, it's hard to see how Peter would not be on the list. So Paul sends this long list of greetings to people at Rome that he knows to be at Rome, that he knows to be part of the church at Rome, that he knows have connections and are involved in the church at Rome, but Peter's not on his list. So there's a really good chance that Peter comes to Rome relatively late. that Peter is not in Rome early as in the Roman Catholic tradition, that he is ministering in other places. The first epistle of Peter says that he is writing from Babylon. The Roman Catholic tradition is, by Babylon he means Rome. It's a sneer at Rome. It's a word that is intended to tell people that Rome had fallen into all the evil of ancient Babylon, which might be true. But it also might be true that he's writing from Babylon in Mesopotamia. And that he means what he says. In the Eastern Church, in the Church of Syria, Armenia, Ethiopia, India, southern India, in all those churches, it is believed, in the ancient Syriac Church, it's believed that Peter had a lengthy ministry in Mesopotamia. There's not any archaeological evidence to support that. But there's a lot of tradition in those churches. There's a lot of belief in those churches down to today that Peter's ministry was significant in Mesopotamia and that he spent time in Babylon as well as other cities in Mesopotamia, and that therefore he wrote First Peter from there. There is an early tradition, which is not backed by very much, that Peter sometime visited Britain. That's a long way. That's a stretch. But somehow there's evidence of Christianity in Britain in the first century. It got there somehow. So that certainly is not evidence that Peter did that, but it's likely that somebody very early on took the gospel to Britain. Our friend Eusebius, in his history, ecclesiastical history, has a lengthy story about how Simon Magus, the guy that Peter faced off with in Samaria, fled from Samaria after that encounter and went to Rome and became a famous magician and seer, such that people in Rome built a monument to him in the Tiber River. And that Peter was eventually called by the church at Rome to come to Rome to have a big face-off with Simon Magus, a big throwdown with him that led to the ultimate defeat of Simon Magus. There's not much besides Eusebius to go on with respect to that story. But Eusebius presents this as this is why Peter came to Rome in the first place, was because Simon Magus was there and it was necessary that Peter come to confront him, Peter having confronted him before. We do know that Peter used John Mark as a secretary and an assistant later on. And Peter is very widely accepted as the principal source of Mark's gospel. Somehow Peter did end up in Rome and somehow was arrested either there or somewhere else and brought to Rome. But Peter was imprisoned in Rome. I mentioned the Lower Mamertine dungeon. The Mamertine, of course, is a medieval name. It was called the Tullianum at the time, or just the Carcere. Carcere was a Roman word for jails, and there weren't very many jails in the Roman world. The Romans didn't build jails. They didn't hold people. They didn't sentence people to time in prison. If the Romans sentenced you to something, they sentenced you to hard labor in the mines, or they sentenced you to row a galley as a galley slave. They didn't sentence you to sit in prison. They didn't think that there was any point in that. And mostly, they use capital punishment or exile. But carcere, of course, is the word that gives us incarceration. Anyway, what is now known as the Mamertine was built originally in the 6th century, and the lower holding cell was a windowless thing that you had to be lowered down into, and it was never cleaned. So it was foul and filthy and often crowded, and very little food was put down there. Prisoners were normally just held awaiting trial or awaiting sentences. They were in process. But Peter allegedly survived some months in the lower Mamertine, which was unusual. People that were put down there usually died if they stayed for any period of time. And perhaps there's a tradition that he converted one of his jailers while he was down there. Peter was almost certainly crucified upside down in Rome, probably by Nero in AD 64 after the Great Fire of Rome. Rome burned for more than a week in July of 64, and in the fall, Nero, looking for people to blame Christians and used that as an excuse to execute a great many Christians and to launch a large persecution. Roman Catholic tradition holds that Peter and Paul were both executed on the 13th of October of AD 64. There is some other tradition that says maybe they were executed in AD 67, very late in Nero's reign. There's some early tradition, Eusebius has this, that Peter was executed either with or just after his wife, that his wife was with him through his imprisonment, and that his last words to her were, "Remember the Lord." And there's some early tradition in the church that the first part of Revelation chapter 11, which is about two witnesses who are unnamed, and the significance of the two witnesses was about, John is actually writing about Peter and Paul. St. Peter's Basilica in Rome was built over the traditional spot. Peter was executed on the Vatican Hill, which was northwest of the city. It was across the Tiber River at the time from the rest of the city, so it was outside the city wall. There was a Roman competitive area out there, and it was also used as a place for executions. And a stone marker was placed there very early on. A monument is reported by visitors to the Vatican Hill late in the 1st century, who claim that they went to the Vatican Hill and they saw the monument to Peter. So Constantine, when the original St. Peter's was built between 320 and 360, Constantine, who laid out the original plan, oriented it to a stone marker that he said was in the ground, and that stone marker is still under the church. The modern church, which was built between 1506 and 1626, is built over that same spot, and the marker is still down underneath it. So it's possible that St. Peter's Basilica today is actually built over the spot. It's certainly built over the spot that people by the 3rd century thought was the spot that Peter had been executed at, that had been passed down as kind of oral history. Bones, not a complete skeleton, were found under the altar at St. Peter's Basilica in the 1950s, and a couple of those bones were subsequently identified as those of a man about 60 or 70 years of age who lived in the 1st century. They were found in a little cutout in the wall near a tomb that is underneath the main altar of the current St. Peter's Basilica. And there are some issues here, of course. The Vatican Hill was outside the city throughout the first millennia, so St. Peter's was sacked by Arab raiders in AD 846. And the records of the time say that the tomb was smashed. They don't say what tomb, they just say the tomb. But it's possible that that's Peter's tomb. The raiders were looking for money, gold, jewels, and probably would have smashed open tombs looking for, assuming that kingly people worthy of great honor would be buried with things that were worth money, which is probably not the case if that was Peter. In any case, the bones were found near a graffiti that says in ancient Latin, "Peter is within." And so these bones are revered by the Roman Catholic Church as those of Peter, and a couple of the bones were recently given by Pope Francis to the Patriarch of Constantinople as an offering of friendship between churches that have been parted for a millennia, and the Patriarch of Constantinople received them as a great gift. So it's possible that we actually do still possess bones from the Apostle Peter that have been preserved down through the ages. It's not certain, but it's possible. So Peter is held by the Roman Catholic Church as the first bishop of Rome, and thereby the first pope in their tradition. But they place him in Rome from the very beginning, and that seems totally untrue. The Liberian Catalog, which was written down, the list that we have comes from 354, doesn't list Peter as the first bishop of Rome. It lists Linus, the guy from 2 Timothy 4:21. In 2 Timothy 4:21, Peter talks about who is with him in Rome, and two of the people are Linus and Claudia. Claudia has been long regarded as Linus's mother. And the Roman Catholic Church holds Linus as the second bishop of Rome, having succeeded Peter on Peter's death. There's a good chance that Linus functionally was the bishop of Rome. The Liberian Catalog says he became bishop of Rome around AD 55 and continued in that role until his death in AD 76. And so that he had been bishop of Rome for most of a decade before Peter was executed. The Liber Pontificalis, which is believed to have been started by Jerome around 400 AD, but the first editions of which we have come from the 9th century, also says that Linus was the first bishop of Rome from about AD 55. So I'm not a believer that Peter was ever the bishop of Rome. I'm not a believer that there's actually any evidence that he was in Rome for long enough to have taken on that kind of a role. There was a significant church in Rome for Paul to write to. Some years before Paul shows up there as a prisoner, and Paul doesn't get to Rome as a prisoner until about 60 or so AD, maybe AD 59, probably the spring of AD 60. And Paul is writing to Rome probably in the mid-50s, and there is already a significant number of people in the church at Rome. There's an early start to the church at Rome. Aquila and Priscilla are very strongly associated with that. They, of course, were expelled by Claudius from Rome in 44, 46 AD. When a bunch of Jews were expelled from Rome, Tacitus says that they were expelled from Rome because there were riots over somebody named Chrestos. And it's possible that Tacitus doesn't have the story quite right, that his spelling is wrong. But it seems likely that Aquila and Priscilla were kicked out of Rome because there was controversy about Jesus among the Jewish community there. and that they were targets of uproar, and therefore they were sent away, and this is why they went to Corinth and met Paul, but that Claudius reversed his decree later and that they returned to Rome. So those are a bunch of things about Peter and a bunch of things to keep in mind as we think about this. We do not believe that the keys to the kingdom or upon this rock are interpreted correctly in the Roman Catholic tradition. We see those things as symbolic in ways that they see them as points of power. In any case, that's some stuff about Peter. Let's move on to Paul. So this is the earliest image that we have of the Apostle Paul. It's a 4th century wall painting from a grotto, a tomb at Ephesus. But once again, very high forehead, balding, longer beard, and of course John Chrysostom in the late 300s said Paul was short and crooked and bald. The Acts of Paul and Acts of St. Peter, which are both apocryphal texts from the 2nd century, agree with that description, and other ancient writers call him the man of 3 cubits, which would make him about 4'6". Now, this is an era when nobody was 6 foot tall, really, but most men were 5 feet tall anyway. So 4'6", he was short. Born in Tarsus, probably around 2 BC, something like that. His father had Roman citizenship, which might have been purchased, but more likely for services to the early Roman authority in Tarsus. The Romans had only recently taken control of Tarsus, and Paul's father may have been granted citizenship for service of some sort. Paul early on was sent to Jerusalem to the school of Gamaliel. Gamaliel, the grandson of Hillel, the greatest teacher of the age, and Gamaliel's school was the most famous of the time. And he learned a kind of rhetoric called diatribe. Diatribe is a Q&A form, which is you ask each other questions as a form of argument. And so Paul was trained in diatribe, probably. At some point he returned to Tarsus, probably, because he apparently went back to learn the family business. His family was a family that believed that you needed to have a trade, and so apparently he went home and learned to be a tent maker at some point. It appears that he was not in Jerusalem at the time that Jesus was visiting, because he doesn't ever write about that, he doesn't ever refer to that. So it appears that he was not present, so he was probably in Tarsus, and maybe that's when he was learning the family business. But he had returned to Jerusalem sometime after the Pentecost, and had returned as a Pharisee who is a son of a Pharisee, a guy who is trained and educated in Hebrew as a Pharisee, and in Greek as an educated Roman citizen, a guy who is familiar with Greek poetry and philosophy. You can see that in his time at the Areopagus, and when he's writing to Titus about Crete, he's very familiar with the culture of the day. Very respected. As a young man, he's a servant to the Sanhedrin in apparently his 20s. Too young to be on the Sanhedrin, but he is one of their key aides, helpers, and has some respect. He shows up in the Acts story, of course, when he shows up at the stoning of Stephen and offers to hold the cloaks of the men who are doing the stoning. And if those men are many from the Sanhedrin, this is the sort of thing that a young man who is an aide, a helper would do to those more senior and respected men. Later on, he calls himself the greatest opponent of the earliest church, the chief of sinners. But he is given this task, he asked for and is given this task, go to Damascus and bring back in chains those who are there who have come to believe in this Jesus. And we do know that he had a sister who lived in Jerusalem because he had a nephew who came to talk to him in Acts 23. It says the son of his sister. So we know nothing else about the rest of his family. But he did work pretty hard to try to make sure that the churches that he was preaching to and teaching to did not have to support him. And so he kept a trade and continued to do that through his life. He's been a huge impact down through the ages in the Roman Catholic Church because he was a single man. And he makes the case that I'm a single man and you should all be like me. There's an oddity about this, which is Jewish young men from good families almost never remained unmarried. Marriage was basically culturally a fundamentally required step for a Jewish young man from a good family. And there's no evidence that any never married man ever served on the Sanhedrin. And Paul was pretty clearly tracking to serve on the Sanhedrin. Widowers served on the Sanhedrin. Married men served on the Sanhedrin. But lifelong single men, there's just no evidence of that. And there's a lot of hostility in the Jewish culture to men who had not invested themselves in offspring, at least attempted to have children. So there is some possibility that maybe he married early and then his wife died, that maybe he was a widower. So there's no way to prove one way or another, but culturally it would be super unusual for him never to have married. And it would be really unusual for him to be the up-and-coming guy that they were going to put on the Sanhedrin if he had never been married. So I think it's important to not read too much into Paul's talk about being a single man has made it easy for me to do the work of the ministry. I mean, he does make that case. I travel, I get beat up, bad stuff happens to me, I sleep out in the open all the time. It's good that I'm single. But I'm not willing to take that as a model because I'm not sure that that was even true for all of Paul's life. He does extol the advantages of ministry without a wife, though, and contrasts himself to Peter in that. Peter brings his wife along. I don't do that. I'm not distracted. His ministry is chronicled in Acts at some length. He focuses on Roman cities as hubs. He works from Antioch around to Corinth, through places like Philippi and Troas and Iconium and Thessalonica, and spends some time in Athens without any real value there, but founds churches in places like Berea and around the periphery of the Aegean Sea and across Asia Minor. And spends 3 years in Ephesus and apparently founds churches in many of the cities and towns around Ephesus during that time, which potentially gives him some personal connection to most of the 7 churches of Asia, which are listed at the beginning of the Revelation. I like F.F. Bruce's New Testament history. This is a readable and interesting book that does a nice job of covering basically the first century. This is a lot easier to read than Eusebius is, so if you're looking for something to jump into, I'd recommend this over Eusebius, certainly. Bruce brings up the possibility that when Paul goes back to Jerusalem and James says you should go purify yourself in the temple to show that you really are still a Jew and to push back these rumors that you basically abandoned Judaism entirely, that Paul may have liked that, partly because Paul says that he was in the temple praying when he had this vision that told him to leave Jerusalem and go to the Gentiles. And that he may have felt like coming back to the temple and purifying himself and praying was the completion, or at least it was a report back, and that potentially it was an opportunity to relaunch on his intent to go to the Western Mediterranean. I want to go to Spain. So Bruce suggests that that may have been in Paul's mind at the time. It's interesting. There's no, I mean, that's just a thing. It's an idea. Paul is subsequently imprisoned at Caesarea under the corrupt and abrasive former military man Felix. Felix, of course, is looking for a little money on the side, and may be aware that Paul brought big money from the churches of Achaia and Macedonia, that he brought this great offering to the church at Jerusalem. And so Felix is probably mystified about how could a guy who could get all that money not raise some other money and come to me with a little, something on the side here to get himself out of jail. Felix was recently married to Drusilla, who was a daughter of Herod Agrippa I. He married her when she was 16, and he was her second husband, and she had previously been engaged to another guy. She was first engaged when she was maybe 12 or 13 and married by the time she was 14, and left that husband to marry Felix. But Felix made a lot of trouble. He was a crackdown guy, a very difficult guy, a guy who used the army to put down all kinds of trouble, and often did so with such a heavy hand that it created more trouble. Felix eventually loses interest in Paul. Felix, of course, is doing all this sort of stuff, and Paul keeps coming and preaching to him about stuff like self-control, not one of Felix's great strengths. Felix is replaced by Porcius Festus, who had never held this kind of position before, but a guy who was known for his efficiency and kind of a punctilious man, a rule-following, process-driven kind of guy is Porcius Festus. And so Festus is this leftover prisoner who's not charged with anything that he can figure out what it is. So Festus falls into a Roman tradition of the time, which was when you've got to make a big decision, you bring together what they called a concilium. You bring together a group of advisors to advise you who have expertise in the topic. So the concilium that he wants to use is the Sanhedrin, because he figures they ought to know. And so he tells Paul, hey, we'll just go up to Jerusalem, we'll talk to the Sanhedrin. And Paul's like, yeah, they're going to kill me. So Paul appeals to Caesar, which puts Festus in this position where he's got to deal with, what am I going to do now? And what are the charges? How am I going to explain this thing to Caesar? So he brings in Herod Agrippa II, and you get the whole thing in Acts about that. Paul goes to Rome. You can read the whole story. Spends 2 years under house arrest, and then Acts ends without telling what happened at the end of that. So Porcius Festus takes a role in 59 AD and disposes of Paul's case pretty quickly, within a few weeks. And so in the fall of 59, Paul gets on a boat to try to make it to Rome. And they get to the Fair Havens off the south side of Crete, and the ship captain is thinking, okay, before the winter storms come in, we can get a little bit further. And then the storm comes in and sweeps them off, and they end up shipwrecked at Malta, and they end up spending the rest of the winter in Malta. Spring of 60 AD, Paul shows up in Rome. It spends 2 years under house arrest, which takes us to the spring of 62, which is when Acts is written and sent, is completed and sent. up through about 62, Nero typically delegated trials to subordinates. He didn't run trials himself as Caesar up through that time. So there's a good chance that Paul's case, if it was decided in 62, was not decided by Nero personally. And that whoever else decided it on behalf of Nero probably thought this is dumb and let him go. In any case, the Roman Catholic Church believes that Paul is not executed until the fall of 64, 2.5 years later. And nobody believes that Paul was executed earlier than that. So if you believe that the time that he's imprisoned at the end of Acts becomes the imprisonment that leads to his death and the imprisonment that's in 2 Timothy, you have to believe that at some point he went before some authority who said, hey, this house arrest thing, you're a dangerous criminal, I'm locking you up in a dungeon and chaining you, because the imprisonment in 2 Timothy is really different than the imprisonment at the end of Acts. And that they held him for another 2.5 years before they decided to execute him. I think it's a lot more likely that Paul was released sometime in AD 62 and then was arrested 2 years later sometime in AD 64. Clement of Rome in the early 2nd century says that Paul passed to the limits of the West in his ministry. Clement is writing from Rome. So the limits of the West has got to be someplace west of Rome for Clement to be willing to say that. So we don't know if Paul ever made it to Spain or whether he went to Gaul or some other place that was to the west. But he was beheaded at Rome. The Roman Catholic Church says in AD 64. There are some others that think maybe it was in AD 65. The Roman Catholic Church teaches that it was on the same day that Peter was crucified. And that Peter was crucified upside down because he did not want to be executed the same way that Jesus was. Peter is crucified because he's not a Roman citizen. Paul's a Roman citizen. So he's taken outside the city wall and beheaded. Peter is crucified on the Vatican Hill, which is northwest of the city and across the Tiber River at the time. It's outside the city walls for the next 1,000 years. Okay. Paul is beheaded on the Ostian Way, which goes south out of Rome, so kind of on the other side of town, close to the Tiber River there, but outside just outside the city wall, potentially, there is a church on the Ostian Way today that claims to be on the site that Paul was executed at. And there are witnesses from the 1st century that say that they've seen the marker on the Ostian Way where Paul was executed. So hard to know the details of that. Tertullian, the Roman, says that anyone who knows him can understand that anything not supremely good would never have been condemned by Nero. That is, that Nero was a guy that if it was bad, he liked it. And the only stuff that Nero really hated was stuff that was really good. So Tertullian, who was not a Christian, believes that if Nero thought you were worth hating, you must have been very good. The Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls is built on the Ostian Way at the reported site. So anyway, so that's Peter and Paul. So next week, I want to talk about James, and James, and James, and maybe James, and James, and James. Next slide. I want to talk about 2 James, 3 James, or 6 James. So these are the James of the New Testament. And we'll talk about who's who and what do we think is true about these guys.